My name is Ahmet Tekelioglu. I'm a research fellow at the Vural Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University, and also editor-in-chief of the Maidan at the center, joined by my colleague Ayşe Mascara from the center. She'll be sending in enhancements and she'll be managing the meeting. Um, so we are very happy to host for our first guest lecturer this semester, Dr. Youssef Chouhoud, my dear friend and an assistant professor of political science at the Christopher Newport University. Dr. Chouhoud comes with a background of someone who is a political scientist who at the same time knows the American Muslim landscape intimately. His talk is titled American Muslim Waters, also not a monolith. And he is, like I said, an assistant professor of political science at Christopher Newport University, where he also directs the minor in human rights and conflict resolution. His research in the US and the Middle East probes support for core democratic norms among understudied groups and contexts. Prior to joining Christopher Newport University, Dr. Chouhoud was a provost fellow at the University of Southern California, where he received his PhD. Um, Please be sure to keep yourself muted during the lecture. Dr. Chouhoud will talk for about 20-25 minutes, close to half an hour, and then we'll receive your questions. Please be also mindful that we are recording this session. Where I am, it's a bit noisy. I apologize for that, but luckily for all of you, I won't be speaking for too long. Um, Without further ado, again, please be on the look for some of the announcements for center's events in the chat, and you will be able to ask your questions either by putting your questions in the chat or by unmuting yourself, just noting that you have a question and you want to speak, and we can unmute you. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Youssef Chouhoud for his talk titled American Muslim Waters, also not a monolith.
All right, thank you very much, Ahmed. Real pleasure to be here. Thank you to the center and to Dr. Peter Mandeville as well. Real honor to be presenting some of my thoughts that I've been gathering on the American Muslim vote over these past few months. And so let me start by acknowledging that the title of my talk today, you might have assumed it was a bit cheeky. It is indeed a bit cheeky. And this is due to the fact that, I'm just kind of referencing this phenomenon that took place in the kind of aftermath of the November election, where it seemed like so many pundits were coming to realize that look at all these minority groups, oh my goodness, Latinos are not a monolith. Oh my goodness, Black voters are not a monolith. How can this, right? And also American Muslims apparently are not monolithic. So yes, so that is a bit kind of coy, I guess, on my end. But it also does actually describe what it is that I think we want to focus on with regards to the American Muslim community, and what kind of motivated some of the voting patterns that we saw. A lot of what I'm going to say, I will fully admit, is couched in some caveats. The main one being that data on American Muslims is tends to be kind of hard to come by. But hopefully, as we go along, I'll be able to at least convince you that there's a compelling narrative there based on the data that we do have. So when we talk about the American Muslim vote in 2020, the reason that it popped up on a lot of radars is because it seems that a lot more Muslims ended up voting for Donald Trump than folks just simply assumed. And obviously, this assumption that not too many Muslims would vote for Donald Trump comes from a lot of the policies that were put in place, a lot of the rhetoric that was said over the past 4 years. We don't have to, necessarily kind of go through the laundry list of quotes and policy proposals. I certainly don't want to do that. I don't imagine too many people want to relive that, to be quite honest. But what I will say is that these past 4 years, they weren't a creation of Donald Trump, right? He with regards to anti-Muslim sentiment, Donald Trump was really more kind of tapping into a reservoir that was already there. And my colleague over at Michigan State University, Nazir al-Israeli, really does show that prior to 2015, up to 2015, when Donald Trump kind of stepped onto the political scene in earnest, there was already quite a bit of negative sentiment being put forth into the public through our main kind of broadcast avenues. And so Muslims would routinely be featured in a far more negative light relative to other minorities, and even in environments where other minorities would get comparatively much more positive renderings in the media. And so within this atmosphere, yes, Donald Trump comes in, and I don't want to kind of make light of what he kind of initiated. Indeed, we see that with the 2016 presidential election cycle, we do see this kind of uptick in assaults and other crimes against Muslims. And for those of you who are familiar with the FBI data on this stuff, it's routinely and endemically underreported. So these are very, very kind of conservative numbers. But the point is, we see a kind of very precipitous uptick. And so with this in mind, right, it was very clear in that 2016 cycle that, yes, there was this kind of negative animus that Donald Trump was kind of putting forth into the world with regards to American Muslims. And so not surprisingly, if you look at the data from 2016, you find that Pew respondents to the Pew survey in 2017, 8% of them reported voting for Donald Trump. So this is the Pew 2017 American Muslim survey, and this is probably as low as you would imagine it being. ISPU later that year asked a full sample of Muslims, so those who didn't vote, as well as those who actually weren't eligible to vote, who they wanted to see win the presidential election, and you get a bit of an uptick there. So about 15% wanted Donald Trump to win. But if this is what the numbers were at 2016, after 4 years of Donald Trump, you would imagine that these 2016 numbers would be a pretty hard ceiling. But that's not what happened. You go to ISPU, and in the early part of 2020, that's when the 2020 survey for ISPU was fielded, 14% wanted Donald Trump reelected. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's not too far away from what we saw in 2016. But this was early in 2020. This was when the choices weren't exactly settled yet, right? We still had Bernie Sanders still effectively in the race. We still didn't know how the pandemic would play out, and even at this early stage, right, you still have 14% wishing for another Donald Trump term. Then we get to the exit polling data, and here we have CARE putting it at 18%, but an even larger share is reported by the Cooperative Election Study. And I want to thank Brian Schaffner for giving me kind of a preview of these data. They haven't been made public yet. So the top line number is 22% of American Muslims in their survey ended up voting for Donald Trump. And then the real shocker came for those who were really kind of paying close attention in the early days following the election. You probably came across this screen grab on a number of Muslim Twitter feeds showing that American Muslims, according to the AP's VoteCast, which is actually, I mean, on its face, seems to be a very robust sampling of the American populace with a fairly large sample of American Muslims, shows that over 1/3 of Muslims voted for Donald Trump. So how do we make sense of this? Well, I guess, kind of the first step is, how do we make sense of these kind of varying numbers? Let's just, for the sake of, kind of moving on, say that the true value perhaps is somewhere in between that CES number and the AP VoteCast number. But that means that, anywhere from, perhaps 1 in 4 all the way up to 1 in 3 Muslims voted for Donald Trump. So again, I ask, what gives, right? So what I'm gonna be trying to do then for the rest of this talk is kind of painting this picture from the available data that we have. You're gonna see me kind of pulling and grabbing from a lot of different data sources. Again, just because, that's the state of affairs when it comes to knowledge about American Muslims. There simply aren't the resources to kind of repeatedly poll at a high quality level this low incidence population in the United States. But hopefully, I can tell you a story, right? So grab some coffee, get into a comfortable chair. I'm going to try to tell you a story here, and hopefully by the end you'll think, all right, I kind of buy what he's selling there. So the story that I want to tell has kind of 3 prongs to it. What might explain the American Muslim Trump vote? Yeah, I think if we focus in on 3 key factors, we can, kind of wrap our heads around what's going on here. The first is racial and ethnic diversity in the American Muslim population, something that, if you're part of the American Muslim population, you kind of experience on a fairly regular basis, but, you might not necessarily even, really appreciate, how diverse this community is. So I'm going to really lean into that. Ideological heterodoxy at a time when the general trend is, very clear and kind of distinct sorting into 2 particular camps. There's a bit of a mishmash of policy preferences with regards to American Muslims, so that, I argue would similarly lead us to see a bit more kind of heterogeneity in the voting preferences than we otherwise might expect. And lastly, I want to talk about some generational splits, and this gets to perhaps not exactly sheds light on the 2020 vote specifically, but tells you, kind of where the electorate was in 2020, and where the electorate, kind of might be going. So it'll be more of a dovetail into, kind of looking into where the American vote is going to be in the foreseeable future. So let me start off with this first point, racial and ethnic diversity. And, the point to make here is that American Muslims are the most racially and ethnic diverse community, a religious community in the United States. Yes, there are, a large proportion of those of Middle Eastern background. There are a large proportion of those of Asian and particularly South Asian background, but there are also a large percentage of Black Americans as well. And indeed, a probably much larger percentage than you would imagine of white Muslims as well here in America. And this is important because racial and ethnic background, conditions a lot of social and political attitudes these days, right? And Muslims, we can't imagine Muslims are going to be kind of immune to these social forces that are kind of motivating so many other groups and societies, right? There's really no a priori reason to believe that. And so, again, to kind of lean into this point of, racial and ethnic attitude, backgrounds kind of conditioning a range of social and political attitudes. This is particularly acute in the time that we live in, and I would highly recommend two books for those who are kind of more interested in kind of digging into this. Identity Crisis by a triumvirate of political scientists, and White Identity Politics by Ashley Jardina. Both of these books really kind of capture a lot of the dynamics that are going on with the politics of race and ethnicity here in the United States today. But just to give you kind of a snapshot, obviously, I don't think I'm making too controversial a statement to say that if you are of a white background, you kind of go through the world and you perceive the world in ways that are different than those who are non-white. I mean, there are multiple kind of bits of data that I could have shown here, but this is just kind of one kind of a data point where if you look at, if you ask a sample, as Pew did in 2019, is increasing diversity kind of a good thing, a bad thing, neither good nor bad? You see a really stark split here between white respondents, Black respondents, and Hispanic respondents in terms of, whether or not they think it's a good thing, right? And you might be thinking, all right, but that's, if you want to talk about social forces in the United States today, I mean, obviously partisanship, that's got to be kind of the main thing. And yeah, you're right. Everything is kind of being viewed through a partisan lens, but this partisan lens, it kind of brings along a lot of these other things as well. And that's because we're being more and more sorted, right, within our partisan camps. It used to be, right, back in the late 90s, that you didn't have too large a split between white, Hispanic, and Black voters in the electorate in terms of kind of a partisan divide. But now you see that this partisan divide has widened quite a bit along these racial lines. And so with all this in mind, then, it's important to note that, again, these social forces are evident within the American Muslim population as well. And the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding in that 2020 survey found that indeed white Muslims were far more likely to approve of Donald Trump in those early days of 2020 than any other racial or ethnic group within the American Muslim community. And if you look at these tallies, right? So yes, this isn't, do you want to vote for Donald Trump or have you voted for Donald Trump? But if you look at these tallies, and then you look at the data that came out after the 2020 election about where groups ended up being, it's actually a pretty good proxy. It actually underestimates the white vote in the general public by a few percentage points. It actually underestimates the Hispanic vote in the general public by even more percentage points. I guess the Black vote for Donald Trump, pretty close. I think it might overestimate, depending on which data you use. It might overestimate by a couple of points, but these are this seems like a pretty good proxy of where people ended up. All right, so but if you buy that, right, that's still only 50% of white voters, right? So white Muslims, in the previous slide, I said they were about 24%, let's say maybe 22% of the American Muslim population. So half of them, that makes 11%. All right, so where did the other 15 to 20% come from? Obviously, that has to come from non-white voters. And if you look at some data that we have from the actual from some polls that were fielded much closer to the date of the November 2020 election, this one coming from the Arab American Institute, it shows that about 30% of Arab American Muslims planned to vote for Donald Trump. So yes, so there was a contingent of non-white American Muslims that similarly wanted to vote for Donald Trump. I just want to kind of bring your attention real quick to this split here. I'm going to be coming back to that towards the end of the session. But indeed, right, there is this still, a sizable chunk of Arabs, yes, but you can probably extrapolate to other groups within the American Muslim population as well. And so this brings me to my second point then, which is ideological heterodoxy within the American Muslim community. So here is some data that my colleague Ryan Burge put together from the 2018 CCES. Again, I guess at that point it was called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. And as we can see, there's a lot, 50%, right? Over half, just about half of Muslims don't really consider themselves even, like slightly liberal, or slightly, like they don't really know where to place themselves, right? And so that kind of intonates that even if they are kind of inclined to one partisan group or another, I mean, they're not wedded to that group or the other, right? And they don't have, for lack of a better way of putting it, a viable political home. And we see that even in even starker terms when we look at the splits between Muslims and Democrats, kind of more generally in the public, as again my colleague Ryan put together. And you see that there are some considerable discrepancies, right, between Muslims and Democrats more broadly on a number of issues, that are kind of central to the Democratic platform. Yes, very close on things such as kind of healthcare, pretty close on DACA and on background checks for guns, but a bit more socially conservative. For example, allowing abortion as a choice, right? Far lower percentage of Muslims believe that you should allow abortion as a choice relative to Democrats as a whole. Or when it comes to taxes, right? So there's this I guess narrative, and seems to be borne out at least partially in the data, that there is a large community of kind of small business owners in the American Muslim community, and yeah, they're not too keen on the tax plans that are kind of central to the Democratic platform. So there's going to be some tension there, right? So yes, you have this one party that is spouting a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment and reinforcing a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment. And yeah, if you're really paying attention to that, and that's going to be the most important thing. But people have different priorities, right? Like anybody else. And so depending on your context, you might prioritize different sets of values over others. And generally speaking, just to give you a bit of American Muslim history, I mean, it really wasn't the case that Muslims were so aligned with the Democrats, not too far in the past. I mean, the first time we can talk about an American Muslim voting bloc was in the year 2000, when they voted for George W. Bush. Now, I will put a kind of small equivocation there, in that American Muslim voting bloc was largely an American Muslim immigrant voting bloc, right? African American Muslims at the time were still very much in the camp that they in the Democratic camp. But nonetheless, there was a considerable kind of lean towards Republicans, at that time. And so what we've seen, kind of gradually over the last 4 years, is perhaps something of a return, a reversion to some sort of prior mean. This is ISPU data looking at Muslims, but we see this in the Arab American Institute's data as well, with regards to Arabs, kind of more generally, something of a reversion back to kind of the pre-Obama mean. And so that takes me then, to the point that I made about the Arab American Institute data, previously, which was this, kind of clear generational split. And when we, kind of think about generational splits, a lot of times, we think about, where does the kind of hot button issues, and if you look at the data, as you would imagine, on these hot button issues of how do we kind of come together, in the pursuit of social justice, we do see a number of generational splits, within the American Muslim community, somewhat similar to those that we see in the broader public. But if you are, kind of surprised by American Muslims kind of voting a particular way, well, then, just keep in mind that, again, like the general public, American Muslim voters are going to skew a bit older, right? So young voters, they're going to have a set of preferences, as we see here, that differ systematically from the preferences of their older co-religionists, right? Here too, when you're talking about do you want to kind of build coalitions with LGBT groups, you see this kind of clear generational split. But if it's the case that, you know, the portion that is kind of most inclined towards a particular position is not the portion that's actually going out to the polls, well, then that's where we're going to see something of a discrepancy between, you know, what the data tell us and what the poll numbers tell us. So that, you know, kind of gives, you know, this broad overview case that I wanted to put together. And you know, I just want to kind of summarize a few bits and the takeaways here that hopefully will that will hopefully kind of you know, highlight some of the points that I've made here. So one is that American Muslims are the most racially and ethnically diverse community in the United States in terms of, you know, religion, right? And, you know, this is still, you know, when we talk about, you know, diversity, I hope, you know, it wasn't my intention to make it seem like this is you know, a flaw or a bug. I mean, it could very well be a feature, right? It really just all depends on how you frame it. You know, if American Muslims are this diverse, well, then, you know, perhaps they shouldn't be taken for granted. Perhaps you actually need to tailor the kinds of messages that are coming either from like externally to the community or from, you know, internal you know, co-religionists to, you know, the community on a broader scale. So this shouldn't be looked at as, you know, a negative per se, right? There's going to be times where you find a lot of cohesion, and there are going to be times where you find, you know, a bit of distinctive preferences and experiences. And so the better question is, you know, under what conditions, among which issues, right, within which environments. And then the other thing is, you know, when we think about, you know, what you know, when we talk about being surprised that Muslims voted, you know, perhaps 1 in 4, 1 in 3 for Donald Trump, you know, again, kind of remember this diversity, because, you know, to kind of sharpen this point, if I were to ask you who is kind of the burning hot core of Donald Trump's political support, I mean, I imagine a lot of folks would be able to answer, well, you know, white evangelicals. Well, white evangelicals, 1 in 5 of them did not vote for Donald Trump, right? So if the white hot core of his base, 1 in 5 of them did not vote for Donald Trump, and this is a homogenous group, certainly much more homogenous than American Muslims. So 1 in 5 of them don't vote for Donald Trump. I mean, you know, why is it that we would expect, you know, a that much uniformity or even more uniformity among a group as diverse as American Muslims? So that's the first point. The second point is that Muslims hold a mix of policy preferences, but they might not hold them as you know, the hold might be as tenuous, much more tenuous than you might imagine. You know, these might not be kind of deeply held preferences. And so this kind of gets to the point that, you know, folks got to put in the work. They can't just assume that because you are a religious minority, boom, you're going to buy into this whole slate of policy preferences, this whole agenda from, you know, one side of the political spectrum. But no, you have to actually convince them, you know, why is it that this is in their interest, right? And you know, this takes some cognitive effort. So kind of help Muslims along if you are, you know, within the community and you want them to kind of go out to the polls and vote a certain way. Don't just simply kind of assume, right, that will be the case. And then lastly, this is the youngest major religious community in America. The median age is around 33. This is very similar to Hindus in America as well. And so I guess this is just, you know, kind of to close on the point that, you know, don't extrapolate perhaps too much from the data from 2020, not least because we were in a pandemic, and, you know, I'm sure there were a lot of other considerations kind of going on in American Muslims' minds, as well as, you know, the electorate at large. But especially with regards to Muslims, we shouldn't, you know, extrapolate too much, because again, this is an electorate that is going to really change, to really come to its own over the next, you know, couple of presidential cycles. And so I'd caution to just, kind of pay attention to the next couple of presidential cycles, and see how it is that this younger cohort gets kind of incorporated within, and the American Muslim electorate kind of writ large. One thing that I'm keeping an eye on is how engagement with institutions really conditions the activity that we see from this younger cohort, because generally speaking, we found that those who are involved in the American Muslim mosque are far more likely to participate in politically, to advocate for social issues. So what happens when that space doesn't become kind of as intimately tied to one's religious identity? Yes, I'm not kind of trying to rag on third spaces or virtual spaces, obviously, especially during a pandemic, but we really have to be kind of cognizant of some of the downstream effects that this might have. So again, kind of focusing on the next couple of presidential cycles, seeing where the dust settles, seeing how this still kind of embryonic American Muslim political consciousness kind of shapes out. That's really what I'm going to be keeping my eye on. And, hopefully I get the opportunity to come back here, after 8 years or so, and see, how things have shifted. And I'll end there, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Youssef. This was such a great sort of presentation and full of data and knowledge points. And we already have a few questions in the chat. So just to remind folks again, if you would like to put a question, just put it in the chat and we'll convey to Dr. Chouhoud. And if you would like to ask on audio, just please raise your hand using the participants button, or just put it in the chat so we can unmute you and you can ask. So I'll start with the order that they appear in the chat. So the first question is from Professor Peter Mandeville, Director of the Islamic Center for Global Islamic Studies. His question is, he says, I would be very interested to hear your analysis about the engage phenomenon and how we should make sense of it in the context of the American Muslim political heterodoxy that you described.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Mandeville. Just going right for it. All right, I like it. So yeah, so for those who might not be kind of fully aware of the controversy that Dr. Mandeville kind of pointed to, there were AVACGIS is this institution that seeks to kind of buoy American Muslim political participation, particularly kind of getting out the Muslim vote, and a number of folks kind of tied to AVACGIS made some comments that weren't exactly kind of representative of where many Muslims lie with regard to Palestine. And Palestine, as you can imagine, is a pretty hot button issue when it comes to the American Muslim community. And so, so that's a great way to kind of frame it, right? This notion of political heterodoxy. I mean, do you have to kind of toe the line on a particular stance in order to, kind of be seen as a legitimate player in the American Muslim political scene? And that's I think what we're seeing right now with the controversy with AVACGIS and with some other kind of similar, perhaps smaller scale and at times kind of larger scale controversies with regards to certain comments that particular kind of celebrity imams, quote unquote, have been making, is kind of the growing pains of American Muslims and how they're kind of coming to terms with the fact that they do have this kind of diverse viewpoint, and the extent to which we kind of are going to draw red lines. I think that's I was in a room the other day on Clubhouse. I don't know if anybody kind of uses it, and it was talking about this issue, almost not exactly AVACGIS, but this notion of kind of deplatforming folks who kind of go beyond the pale. So what is beyond the pale? I think that's something that we really are going to have to wrestle with. it does seem, in particular with regards to Palestine, especially with regards to, some other organizations that have had, some comments on Palestine that haven't really kind of, again, felt representative of the American Muslim community. That does seem, a bit of a third rail. And so if that is kind of the threshold, then that's one thing. But if we start drawing, numerous kind of red lines on other issues, I mean, if you aren't, buying wholesale, for example, support for a particular social justice movement, or you are engaging in a particular social justice movement, does that kind of place you beyond the pale? I mean, that's what I worry about. I think what American Muslims need to wrestle with is this diversity, and again, kind of seeing it as a feature rather than a bug. And what we're seeing now with Mgage and others is kind of the growing pains, I think, kind of wrestling with that heterodoxy, wrestling with that diversity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Youssef, for that. There is a question and a few comments that was attached to that in the chat, and then we'll go to Eman. The question is from Noma. So he asks you, do you know for the ISPU survey, who is defined as white Muslims? Are these converts? Could it be Arabs? And then other comments, of course, highlighted it could be Turks, other Central Asians, or Persian Americans as well.
Thank you for that. Yes, excellent. This is actually something that I am writing a brief piece, a follow-up kind of secondary analysis for ISPU for, and actually this follow-up piece is titled, who are these white Muslims? So kind of be on the lookout for them. But to preview that piece, so in the ISPU study, we give folks, a menu of racial and ethnic options. One of them is white, one of them is Arab. And so could there be some Arabs, as we would, kind of code them as Arab in that white population? Yes, absolutely, right? Because at the end of the day, the only way we can talk, in coherent terms about racial ethnic identity is in terms of self-identity, right? Not putting other people in a box. And so, in that category in the ISPU data does not include, I would venture to say, the vast majority of folks from the Middle East and North Africa. Who it does include, well, it includes, a lot of, white converts, but not all, white American converts. If we look at the Pew data, their white non-MINA portion of the study, only 1/3 of them are converts. And so you still have 2/3 that are not converts. So who are these 2/3? Well, these are the folks coming from the Balkans. These are the folks coming from, the Caucasus, Russia, and yes, if you are Iranian, if you are Turkish, perhaps a bit more controversially, you would put yourself typically down as white. And so, who are white Muslims? Well, it's those that self-identify as white Muslims. And when you give them a menu where they can put other, where they can put, Arab, and they still choose white, well, that's telling you something. That's telling you about, how they see themselves, how they go through the world. And so that's why, I'm fairly confident in the data that we have on white Muslims based on how we set it up.
Well, thank you so much, Youssef, for that. So next we're going to Iman. Kindly unmute yourself and please ask your question, Iman. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Hey, Youssef. Great talk. So I have two questions. One is a clarifying question about something you presented, and the other is a kind of more conceptual question. The clarifying question was actually about that slide where you present like Muslim views versus the average Democrat. The super useful slide, by the way. If you could pull it up, I think it might be easier for me to reference it that way. Yay. Okay, so you were mentioning tax cuts, and you mentioned like, petit bourgeois, like, Arabs and Muslims. And it sounded like you were saying that would make them more anti-taxation. But my reading of this chart is that that the Muslims are actually more pro-taxation. Or are these like reverse coded, like cut corporate taxes and cut taxes on wealthy? my reading of this chart is that the Muslims are more pro-tax. Is that right?
So I think this is not the as I read it, and I will have to check with my colleague Brian, but as I read it, this is so cut corporate taxes, right? So less taxation.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Cut
So less taxes on the wealthy,
taxation,
less taxes, right? So about a fifth, about a quarter of Democrats would want to cut taxes on the wealthy, about a fifth would want to cut taxes on the corporate, but that kind of doubles among Muslims.
Yeah, that's interesting because like I know the Pew data has these like small government versus big government this measure, small government with fewer services or big government with more services, and it seemed like people were overwhelmingly pro big government, more services, but then they were kind of economically conservative on some other questions. I forget which one. There was one I think that was like taxation especially. Yeah, that's interesting.
If I could just say one thing really quick. So that kind of goes to my point about, like don't take this slide or really, any kind of policy preference that, in general Muslims have as kind of set in stone and coherent kind of across the board, right?
Yeah.
Like there is room to kind of move folks on issues, right? If the work is put in.
Yeah, especially if they're not like, particularly aligned to a particular platform. Yeah. My other kind of question for you is a broader question about so one of the arguments that I saw getting made online about trying to explain this like 1/3 of Muslim voters was about foreign policy. So people were saying, so one argument was like, so the argument, it goes something like, well, Trump, even though he did all these like horrible things abroad, he was less interventionist in the Middle East, less interventionist in like Muslim countries than previous administrations. And so either people were appreciative of that or were able to put foreign policy aside and focus on other things. What do you make of that argument? Do you buy that?
So thank you so much for that. That's an excellent observation and question. So I do not buy the general foreign policy framing of that, right? To where, in general, you are a fan of Donald Trump's foreign policy. Where I do think there's some validity is if you are kind of a one issue voter on a particular foreign policy. So if you are a one issue voter on the Uyghurs, Donald Trump was actually pretty good on the Uyghurs, right? If you are a one issue voter on, supporting autocrats in the Middle East, well, then Donald Trump is your guy, right? And kind of along those lines, right? So you're gonna have your one issue voters within the American Muslim community, like you're gonna have within any other community. How much that really moved the needle, I don't know. I can't imagine it was a ton. This is purely speculation on my part, but I just if you are an Egyptian and you're a really big fan of Sisi and then you go and vote for Trump, I mean, I can see that conceptually, but I can't see that moving kind of that community kind of writ large, and that's just my 2 cents.
Thanks. And I would imagine that like a follow-up would be, well, who are those one issue voters? And I would imagine that like Arabs and South Asians would be more likely. And so if those aren't the people voting for him, then anyway, but thanks, Youssef.
Thank you.
Oh, wonderful exchange. Thanks to both of you for that. There are a few comments, of course. Professor Mandeville says that we should look at Clubhouse as a discursive space for American Muslims, let alone some of the other platforms. Just want to, before I come in with my own questions, want to invite additional questions. Are there any additional questions currently?
On that point of Clubhouse being a discursive space, by the way, I actually just invited Iman to Clubhouse because there are so many really, really rich conversations going on there. So I definitely co-sign that point.
Wonderful. Youssef, 2 questions from me as someone who works in American Muslim space, kind of a recovering political scientist. One is, what are the limitations of the data? And then, because you run these and all of this, is any of those blind spots in the data like addressable? I'm asking this partly also with the knowledge that Catalyst, who produces WAN data, is retiring their religion model. And, you know, some of us who work in the American Muslim civic engagement space are trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to sort of, deal with that? So that's one data. What are some of the intersections between private sector organizations like Pew and political scientists in academia? As someone who has a good grasp of that landscape, if you can give us some of that. That's one question. And then the second question is the discourse that you have alluded to, and we have discussed this, Muslims voting against their own interests discourse. So how to sort of engage with that, and what would these data points, you think, tell to, say, Democrats, like the sort of Democratic Party establishment, who has established relationships with the American Muslim landscape? What do you think they see when they look at the same data and the interpretive framework that you have shown to us? Would it mean that, hey, other than some symbolic politics, it's really not, there isn't enough returns on investment, quote unquote?
Yeah, thank you for those really pointed questions, Ahmed. I appreciate it. Or Ahmed, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to Arabicize your name. But so on the first point of the data, I mean, so Pew, I think, is for what we have now, I think Pew is gold standard. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that there are no limitations. The number one limitation is that, it's only put out kind of periodically, right? So they have an 07, they have an 11, and they have a 17 survey. And I understand why they don't put it out every year. I mean, talking millions of dollars, so no shade on Pew, right? But obviously there's going to be some kind of trade-offs with that, with those gaps. With full disclosure that I do my work with, I do a lot of data analysis and work with ISPU. I would argue that ISPU offers the next best, option to Pew. Does it have its limitations? Of course it does, right? But I think the fact that it has been able to field it every year, during the election cycle in 2016 up through the election cycle in 2020, that offers a really rich data source for researchers. So where do political scientists come in? So the blind spots in both of these studies from a political science perspective is, a lot of times the questions that we really care about, the pointed ways, the precise ways in which we ask questions in political science, you're not going to get that on these, kind of more general surveys, because you have to, you're going for a lot of, the Pews and the ISPUs of the world. They're going for, telling you more kind of description, right? And a lot of times when you're talking about description, that's going to lead you to a particular kind of set of questions and a particular kind of framing of questions. And, the things that, some political scientists, would love to see on there, like, say, a question about American Muslim linked faith, right? To what extent do you believe that what happens to Muslims in America affects what happens to you? That's not a question that we see on a lot of these surveys. And so it's left to then political scientists to fill in that gap. And so I'm happy to report, actually, that I'm part of this project, the cooperative I really should know the acronym. I'm so sorry. CMPS. It's a huge project where, we're sampling the general public alongside oversamples of a number of minority communities, including American Muslims, where we're going to get a lot of really rich data and ask really tough questions that you might not get in a Pew and an ISPU. So hopefully, that kind of got at where you're getting with that first one. In terms of the Democrats and what they should make of this is, well, first and foremost, they shouldn't take American Muslims for granted. And if you are an operative, right, particularly if you are an American Muslim operative for the Democratic Party, these data should tell you that you need to do some work, right? You shouldn't kind of assume that Muslims are just going to automatically kind of tie in, what you feel is kind of, in their best interest with the Democrats, because what is viewed as in their best interest is going to be a function of a lot of different things, including the environment that they're in. Yet, for example, in Michigan, and in Minnesota, they tend to lean a lot more Democratic, the Muslims up there, than in Texas, right? And so we need to be cognizant of context. We need to be cognizant of the fact that the way we frame issues is going to matter, right? Why is political communication its own sub-discipline? Because it matters. The way that you communicate politics in order for a certain population to digest it, that's where the work has to be put in. And so I hope that those that want to reach out to the American Muslim community kind of really take that to heart.
Wonderful. No, thank you so much. That's very helpful. Just a quick follow-up, and then we'll go to Norma, who raised hand. You came to kind of the states level data. Do we have enough on do you have?
We don't have. Yeah, we don't have a ton. And we don't have a ton. And so that's why I didn't put it up in my slide. I didn't want to kind of mislead folks. If we group together like the Midwest, right? And you group together like the South, right? Using kind of census coding for regions in the ISPU data, you do see a bit of a divide, just based on the fact that, we don't have a large N. It's like just south of statistical significance. And so I didn't want to kind of mislead folks. From my opinion, though, I do feel like there is something there, and hopefully, more data would shed light on it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you, Emma, for putting the link to your article. That's wonderful. No, we welcome that. Okay, we'll go to Norma. If you can unmute and ask your question, Norma.
Hi, I hope it's okay. I didn't turn on my camera. I'm too lazy to get my hijab out. Could you go back to that screen that had, I think it's from 2018, and it was that line showing, I think, a spectrum of views. It can include liberal and moderate. Yes, this one. I was curious, since it came out in 2018, could this apply to congressional elections? Or even, I know the importance of looking for serving for the presidential, but I noticed even during the Georgia Senate runoff races, there was a difference when you looked at the number of Hispanics and Blacks that went for Trump, but then they still voted for the Democrat candidates in Georgia. Do you think something like this could be applied to congressional races for Muslim populations, or even considering the changes in Muslim polling for congressional races, especially because I like what you had to say about the different communities, about people in Minnesota and Michigan.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, so the CCES, it's a really, I mean, they survey like tens of thousands of folks. I think this 2018 data has like 60,000 respondents, which is the only reason that you're able to kind of break it down to American Muslims, just because the sample is just so large. And if I understood your question, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if I understood your question, Norma, you were asking whether we could, kind of extrapolate the fact that there are so many moderates to kind of better understand what's happening on a kind of a state level, with congressional elections. And
I wasn't even asking that, but I like that question so much more. So go ahead. I think I was just trying to understand, do you think the data, can you extrapolate that? Or do you think there's enough shifts that it would be different if we looked at how they vote on congressional and Senate races?
I see what you're saying. So this wasn't a sample of voters, but it was just simply a sample of all of the kind of the electorate writ large, that those who are able to vote. And so I think that there's no reason to believe that there was a dramatic shift between 2018 and 2020 in terms of where Muslims fall on the ideological spectrum. I mean, obviously there's going to be some contraction, some expansion, but I think the takeaway that the plurality, if not the majority, right? So the clear plurality, if not the majority of Muslims, are in this kind of liminal space where they're not entirely comfortable talking about themselves as a liberal or a conservative. I do think that holds. I think it's partly because A, they don't have particularly strong views, or or B, that they have, you know, a strong view this way and a strong view this way, and so they kind of, you know, end up in the middle. And so, you know, this is, you know, I do feel that, you know, the kind of the big kind of point that Muslims are just, you know, not very kind of ideologically settled on so many different issues. How that relates then to their vote choice on a subnational level, I do think that's a really interesting question. I haven't really, you know, dug into it, you know, but I think, you know, I'd love to hear any thoughts that you may have into as to, you know, other roads to kind of go down in that route. But, you know, there's so many different pathways that are still open for those who want to research American Muslims, just because honestly, we don't have enough research on American Muslims. So that's just one, and hopefully, you know, if not me, somebody else will take it up.
Wonderful. Youssef, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. If there are any last minute questions, we'll wait for another minute. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank my colleague Ayşenur Mascara for managing everything about this meeting. We also, you know, would love to bring your attention to Youssef's hopefully upcoming, forthcoming essay on the Maidan about this subject and related matters. Please be on the look for announcements from the center. Sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media, as we have upcoming talks from center in March and April. We'd love to see you all there. And thank you so much to all of you for tuning in, and Lisa for doing this research and for being so generous with your time to share it with us. We are grateful once again. Ayşenur, any announcements as we close?
Thank you so much, Ahmet Selim. So you can follow us on social media, Facebook and Twitter. I just shared those information in the chat box. So we have an upcoming event in April 14, and we will share the Zoom information soon. We will post other events. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Youssef.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure.